given the overall day for me to kick off, and Roberto will kind of wrap things up with his talk. Largely I've been asked to talk a bit about my great passion, which is the topic of education and revolution, and this, I suppose, the role of education in a revolutionary context in terms of developing socialist citizenry. So it's quite a specific topic, although I think, even though it's a specific theme, it holds, it's a very important aspect of revolutionary strategy more broadly, and certainly in terms of 21st century socialism. I think it's something very interesting and will be a really important feature of the Venezuelan revolution and how it unfolds. And then Roberto will give a far more general overview of the Cuban and Venezuelan revolutions and their specific significance today for global politics. And I suppose, as Rob just pointed out a second ago, it'll be a neat summary or a neat bringing together and obviously a pretty positive take on where to now, given all the themes and topics that people have discussed today. The only thing is you might have to flush the time thing again, otherwise I'll talk forever. Oh, how much? 20. 15? Let's go to 15. Okay. So, education and revolution, developing socialist citizenry in Venezuela and Cuba. I suppose the thing about education is it continues to be held up as, in terms of a reformist perspective, it continues to be held up as a key element of an attempt to humanise capitalism. Education is still held up as this great leveller. Through education we'll break generational poverty. Through education these whole notions of social capital and human capital. Education is always at the centre of ongoing attempts to kind of take reformism one step further and as people argue, to humanise capitalism. And so while today I'm talking about particular educational reform in Venezuela and the reform that's sort of been an ongoing part of Cuba's revolutionary project since '59. Obviously the global context is that educational reform is going on everywhere. It's certainly not exclusive to countries undergoing revolutionary transformation. UNESCO, what does it stand for? United Nations, can't remember what the end of that is, but the United Nations peak education organisation has a program called Education for All, which is basically about the massive expansion of education, at least to a primary school level internationally. And essentially, it's on paper that this UNESCO drive for education for all, is mass expansion to access to education, but also talks, on paper in words about preparing global citizens and preparing lifelong learners and, equipping, in particular, obviously in so-called developing countries where, an increase to access means people actually attending school and undertaking some kind of formal schooling at all. The idea is that this is going to contribute to, the lag that developing countries are experiencing before they catch up. Although, of course, all of that is being couched a little bit differently given the current global economic crisis. But still, education is still held up as still this potential tool to somehow fix things. So I guess the points that came up in the last topic about whether capitalism can indeed be fixed or whether as we would argue, it's unfixable. Education is right in the centre of a lot of those sort of liberal reformist kind of discussions that are going on. Obviously, it's also about efficiency and effectiveness and all that sort of stuff as well. There's the economics of education, so to speak, which I don't really have time to go into today. And even where they're sort of at the better end of that process internationally. So even where they are meaningfully increasing access to people, for people, they are increasing the quality of education that people are receiving and all that sort of stuff. It's essentially and ultimately maybe slightly more equitable and maybe slightly more meritocratic, i.e. accessible to broader layers and whatever. But ultimately the role of education under capitalism and all the, rather than decreasing the growing socioeconomic inequalities of capitalism remain totally unquestioned. So, despite decades of these sort of reforms and programs and interventions and overhauls to education systems, obviously educational inequality persists, and statistics in a place like Australia are pretty interesting. Like even where Australia holds up okay in terms of outcomes, because of course the other thing about global education agenda at the moment is that there's a mad emphasis on testing and constant standardisation and so on. Even where Australia might look okay nominally in terms of standardisation, where Australia looks appalling from a developed country's point of view is inequality. The inequality of opportunity in education in Australia actually, I can't remember where we sit on the UNESCO tables, but we look pretty damn shocking. So anyway, in terms of today, as capitalism melts down and breeds more and more injustice and conflict and worsening and irresolvable inequality, the need for an education that actually directly supports the transformation of this current global reality, i.e. an education for socialism, is needed now more than ever. And so I think talking about education in the context of revolutionary Cuba and Venezuela is important, not only in understanding those revolutionary processes themselves, but also in terms of contributing to that debate amongst educationalists internationally and how it's playing out in terms of, also, which again I can't go into today, but also the question of how education now can feed into and be a part of anti-systemic, anti-capitalist struggle. So the focus of my talk today, however, is basically using the examples of Cuba and Venezuela and looking at how education, with its objective of developing a socialist citizenry, is central to revolutionary strategy. And in the case of Venezuela, a critical aspect of the struggle for a 21st century socialism. Okay. So historically, Marxists would argue that education has essentially served one of two purposes: integration or transformation. Just to sort of set the scene a bit, I suppose, in terms of education itself under capitalism. Obviously, under capitalism, it's ultimately about integration. That is to say, it's about preparing conforming citizens who will effectively integrate into the system, and it's ultimately about social stability, student conformity. Maybe some mild reformism can go along with that, but essentially it's about a passive, accepting, society. And this, obviously, as Marxists have long argued, ultimately benefits the dominant social class. Directly counterposed to this is a revolutionary, transformative education, an education for socialism, which basically has anti-systemic views which promote democracy as empowerment of the student. And I would argue, from my research into the Cuban education system, that there's certainly democratic, transformative education has played a key and in fact a central role in the longevity of socialist Cuba. Ultimately, in Cuba, education is not, whereas in capitalist societies it's essentially a relatively passive filter for the reproduction of dominant ideas, that is the ideas of the ruling class at any point in time. In Cuba, it's the absolute opposite. It's basically valued on the basis of its ability or it's the fact that it's a motor force of generating new ideas, and it's a battlefield, if you like, for the contestation of ideas. It's nothing passive, or very little passive about the education system in Cuba as I saw it. And I think, from what I've seen, although I've studied it less, and there's lots more to say about it, and the Venezuelans themselves would say it's absolutely at the starting point, I think we're seeing a very similar process and a very similar perspective on education as part of revolutionary strategy in Venezuela in terms of this battle of ideas. And I think the example of both countries reflect the possibilities and, of course, some challenges for the development of an education system which can inform and deepen the post-capitalist transition and develop the revolutionary consciousness of the people. So just to quickly, people may already know this, but just I wasn't sure, so I just wanted to put in a few sort of more specific statistics or bits of information around what we're talking about, particularly in terms of Venezuela. And as I said, the interesting thing when you're talking to people involved in education in Venezuela, although I think it goes for the struggle entirely, but people are at pains to say that they're starting now, this is the starting point of a process, and everything until now has just been setting up for the main game, which is ultimately the construction of a radically different Venezuela based on 21st century socialism. Concretely though, obviously both Cuba and Venezuela have eradicated illiteracy, which is no small thing. More importantly, or no, not more importantly, equally importantly and critical to sort of understanding